So, welcome everybody, and I want to thank you for joining us for another webinar brought to you by the Motor Safety Association. My name is Nathan Costrin, and today our webinar topic will be about violence in the workplace. More specifically, we're going to be keying in on the changes that they made to the Occupational Health and Safety Act and regulations regarding violence in the workplace, and what your organizations need to be or do to be compliant with these changes. So just for you guys, your microphones have been muted and will remain muted for the duration of the webinar. However, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to enter them into the question box, and I'll respond to you directly by email at the conclusion of the webinar and get those questions answered. Also, resources for today's webinar are going to be linked to the registration page where you signed up for the webinar on our website. So please check them out. They're meant to help guide you in the development of your own violence policy and prevention plans. So do check those resources out. They are very helpful and are going to help you kind of navigate these changes that were made. So just kind of kicking things off here, I took a little excerpt out of an article I read here, a news article, and I quoted Don Morgan, the Labor Relations and Workplace Safety Minister, and he says that everyone has the right to feel safe when they come to work, and having a violence policy and investigating all incidents is a step towards protecting workers from acts of violence. So ultimately, workplace violence prevention it's crucial to safeguarding your employees' health and well-being while maintaining efficient and effective operations. Having a strong policy and plan in place is going to ensure that it's going to allow you to prevent violence from taking place at your workplaces. It's also going to help you in reducing costs associated with these types of incidents and ensure compliance with legal obligations. And ultimately, it's going to foster a positive workplace culture at your organization as well. So, according to our legislation, workplace violence is defined as the attempted, threatened, or actual conduct of a person that causes or is likely to cause injury and includes any threatening statement or behavior that gives a worker reasonable cause to believe the worker is at risk of injury. So some key points I want to kind of point out in that definition is it states attempted, threatened, or actual conduct. So this includes any action or behavior that has potential to cause harm, whether it's merely attempted, explicitly threatened, or actually carried out, right? There's also another piece in there. It says causes or is likely to cause injury. And the definition is meant to encompass not only conduct that results in physical harm, but also conduct that has a reasonable likelihood of causing injury. And the last piece there is threatening statements or behavior. So any verbal or even nonverbal communication or action that's meant to intimidate, coerce, or put somebody in fear for their safety is recognized and considered to be workplace violence. So that definition is fairly broad and obviously not limited to physical assaults, and it includes a wide range of behaviors. And we'll kind of cover off some of these items. So right out of the gate, the obvious one is physical assault, right? So any hitting, pushing, kicking, slapping, any form of physical attack would be considered violence. Throwing objects or using a weapon, right? All those things. Verbal threats and intimidation. So direct threats of violence against somebody, saying like, you better watch your back. You're going to pay for this. I'm going to smack you, whatever that is, or even something indirect, like, something's going to bad is going to happen to you, if you don't do X, Y, Z things. So all those things, those verbal threats, those things that are meant to intimidate, again, they fall under this policy. Threatening behaviors, staring at people in a menacing kind of manner, glaring at them, using kind of intimidating gestures that are intended to threaten people or ultimately cause fear, right? Those would be considered under this violence policy. Even raising a fist or faking like you're going to slap somebody, all those things would be covered under here. Digital or remote threats. So this is looking at threatening emails, texts, social media posts, any electronic communication method. These are covered under this new legislation. making phone calls or voicemails to people, even if it's outside of the workplace, that are, again, meant to threaten people. That would be covered as well. Excuse me. So violence outside the traditional workplace setting, and this would kind of extend itself to offsite business functions, things like conferences, trade shows, social events related to work. Just because we're outside the workplace setting, it doesn't mean that this legislation doesn't apply. It applies to even when you're in these other settings, right? And again, threatening calls, texts, all that kind of stuff would fall under there. Violence by third parties, so this could be by a customer, client, anybody outside your organization with whom your workers interact with as part of their job. Keeping in mind things like robberies, assaults, aggressive behavior from the public, especially in those high-risk sectors like our gas stations, right, within our rate codes. They have to be aware or more aware of violence by these parties, because they tend to be open later at night, and we're actually going to touch on that a little more specifically here later on. And then the last one there, domestic violence. So situations where domestic violence extends into the workplace, such as a partner or family member harassing or threatening a worker at their place of employment. I actually spent almost a decade in loss prevention, and almost half of it as a manager, and managed a loss prevention crew. And we actually had this on more than one scenario where a spouse had come into the workplace, obviously wasn't getting along with the worker, their spouse who worked for us. And on a couple of those situations, we had to intervene, or our department had to intervene. And there is an opportunity for some spillover, and you have to be as prepared as you can be for those situations. But oftentimes it's just being able to, I guess, get people from being irate or very confrontational to, first calming them down, and then kind of letting them know this isn't the appropriate setting to handle these things. But we'll talk a little bit about that when we kind of speak to some of the control measures you folks can maybe put in place when you're considering workplace violence at your own workplaces. So some of these examples, they should underscore that workplace violence, it's not limited to just physical assaults, but also includes a wide range of threatening, intimidating, and harmful behaviors that can affect people's physical and psychological well-being. Again, that legislation, this new legislation is meant to emphasize and have a broad approach, an inclusive approach to identifying and addressing these various forms of violence that you might encounter in your careers or at your workplaces. And again, also kind of highlighting, it's also important to note that it doesn't just occur at work. It might be not within the physical workplace itself, but possibly outside of work as well. So the previous legislation required only prescribed places of employment that provided specific service or activities to have a written violence policy statement and prevention plan. And some of the examples of those places were like healthcare facilities, educational services, policing and correction services, security, other law enforcement services, late night retail premises. So like I said, gas stations, right? Places that are open past 11 o'clock until I believe 6 in the morning, financial services, taxis, transit services, all of them would have been considered high risk sectors for violence potentially. So that was covered under the prior legislation. And they also outlined some additional safety measures to be taken by places that would be considered a late night retail premises or operation due to that high risk and them obviously operating during hours of darkness. So we'll discuss some of that. But this segues nicely into the next slide, which is what is required by the newest legislation. And so as of May 17th, 2024 this year, all workplaces in Saskatchewan must now implement a policy statement and prevention plan to eliminate workplace violence. And this applies to all provincially regulated workplaces, whether an employer or workplace is in a high risk industry or not. So with that being said, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start out here with a quick high-level overview of some of the general responsibilities for employers and workers as it pertains to the Violence Policy Statement Prevention Plan, and then we'll kind of dig into more of the details regarding the legislation. So let's start with the employer responsibility. So they're ultimately the one responsible for ensuring the development and implementation of these types of policies and plans at their workplace. So there's some essential items that need to be included in an employer's statement and plan, of which some are listed here. So risk assessments. So employers are required to conduct regular assessments of the risk of violence at their workplaces. And this is one of the activities they'll do at the outset of developing their policy and plan. They're also responsible and obligated to implement measures and controls to minimize or eliminate identified risks that come from the risk assessment. And we'll be discussing some of those controls as well today. And we've provided some resources for you to kind of get you thinking about what types of controls and hazards and things like that that you should be considering at your own workplaces. Employers are also responsible to develop and implement written policies and procedures regarding violence prevention and how to respond to violent incidents. They also need to provide training and education so that all workers are trained on recognizing, preventing, and responding to incidents of violence. And employers also must establish clear procedures for reporting incidents of violence, ensuring that the confidentiality of certain parties are protected, and that there's also protection from retaliation as well, coming from the complainant, obviously. Also offer support and resources to workers who experience violence, including access to counseling or other resources that they may need after the fact. Worker responsibilities. Workers are responsible for reporting any incidents or threats of violence to their employer or the designated individual. That might be their supervisor, a health committee member, whoever that is, and do that promptly. They're also responsible for understanding and adhering to the workplace policies and procedures related to work violence prevention that are put in place by the employer. And they should also be participating, obviously, in their training provided by the employer and utilize that training as they're needed and required to do so. And one of the more important pieces, collaboration and consultation. Workers should be providing feedback and bringing forward any hazards or concerns or things that risks they think that are going to benefit the employer in terms of identifying, assessing, and controlling the different hazards at your workplace and the risk of violence. Employers should also be encouraging, obviously, workers to collaborate with them to create a safer workplace and providing feedback on policies and the different risk factors involved with your workplaces. And the OHC and your safety representatives, or the Occupational Health Committee and your safety representatives, play a very important role in that regard as well. So who is protected? Well, the legislation was aiming to create a safe and inclusive work environment by protecting not just traditional employees, but also anyone who might be involved in or connected to the workplace, regardless of their official status. That broad scope kind of reflects the understanding that violence can affect anyone in the workplace, and comprehensive protection is necessary to ensure safety for everyone. This information is crucial for employers as well as their workers, so that they understand what their rights and responsibilities are under the new legislation, and ensuring that everyone in the workplace is aware of the protections that are afforded to them. Part of the changes to the legislation was actually updating the definition of what a worker is to include students and volunteers who are permitted by an employer directly or indirectly to perform worker services at their business, or is being trained possibly by an employer. So it's meant to be a little bit more all-encompassing. And as you can see, we've got our employees, managers and supervisors, students and volunteers, contractors and subcontractors as well. So when you bring contractors on or to work for your business, especially if they're going to be there for any extended period of time, having a contractor orientation that includes your violence policy and prevention plan is going to be very important, and communicating that piece. And also visitors as well, right? It's not explicitly covered necessarily in the legislation, but it's important to note that under certain circumstances, they may be protected as well when visiting your workplace. So again, it's meant to afford protection for essentially everybody who you may interact with at your workplace. So some employers might feel that they should incorporate their violence policies with other policies. Oftentimes, we'll see the harassment and violence policies together, or we'll see them, on the same page or same document. And the legislation actually requires that these policies must be independent of each other. In other words, each policy statement needs to be treated as its own separate entity. So we should no longer be seeing the harassment and violence policies covered together. Those should be apart, and they should have kind of be treated as their own separate entity. And just to be clear as well, the amendments that were made in the Occupational Health and Safety Act have not been fully amended in the Occupational Health and Safety Regulations as of yet, but I anticipate that's going to happen soon. And the likely reason for that is they haven't they're likely making additional amendments in other sections of the regulations. And I'm guessing we might see a new version of those regulations here in the coming months, maybe by the end of the year, start of next year. But I just wanted you to know, because I know I've been asked a couple of times, where does it say this or that in the regulations? And actually, you'll find some of the information in there, but not all, because they haven't made that amendment in the regulations specifically yet. However, they are still, as of like I said, May 17th, they are enforcing that companies need to have these prevention policy statements and plans in place, regardless of if the regulations have been fully amended yet. So just a word of the wise, a word to the wise for you. So also, or did I skip ahead there? I did. So we're going to cover off some of the key steps to also developing a policy and plan. And I kind of wanted to break this out for you in a kind of a practical terms that we often use in safety, which is identify and assess, consult and develop, and then ultimately implement your plan. Some of these can be kind of almost taken together in the same step a little bit, and you're going to see that mesh a little bit here as I move the slides forward. But there's a bit of that consultation piece that needs to happen in the identifying and assessing piece. But this is good kind of systematic approach to go about developing these policies and plans, ensuring that we've had adequate consultation with our workforce and that we're developing the best plan possible to counteract workplace violence. So let's start with identifying and assessing hazards. So this is the first step, right, in developing this workplace violence policy and plan. It's conduct a thorough assessment of your business and the potential risks and existing conditions within your workplace by gathering information. One of the best sources of information is going to be your workers, right? So one thing I would encourage you to do is, and we will also link this in the resources, is conduct a survey or an audit of your workplace to identify potential hazards that could lead to violence. Workplace surveys are going to be great to get the feedback of your workers, because they're often dealing with the general public as well as, different people, obviously, within your business. Sometimes things go unreported or underreported at your businesses as well. And this is an opportunity for your workforce and your workers to engage with you and give you feedback on whether it's external customers, possibly another worker at the business, where maybe some of these behaviors that we've discussed earlier might be present, and an opportunity for you to address those things through proper reporting procedures, things like that. So again, conduct that survey or audit of your workplace. And again, include things like physical conditions, poor lighting, isolated work areas, right? Any operational factors as well that you want to take into consideration, like handling of money and, like I said, working with the public. I know a lot of people are going to take for granted the fact that, oh, like a dealership, for example, my wife works in car sales. So, it's like, oh yeah, no, you would think kind of at first blush, we just sell cars. We don't have to worry about violence at the workplace. But when you're dealing with the general public, you never know who you're dealing with. So you should still have procedures and strategies in place for dealing with people who might be irate customers and not happy with, either the service done to their car or what have you, but identifying those types of scenarios as well. Reviewing past incidents. So analyze any past incidents of violence or threats or, ideally anything that's happened within the past year. And if obviously you need to go back further because something stands out to you that you should consider as well, by all means, go back further. But kind of looking at the last year or so, aggregating some of that data, and that's going to help you identify, again, any high risk areas and positions at your business and help ensure that you have the appropriate practices, procedures, and policies in place to deal with those different situations. So look at things like incident reports and investigations that you've done. Is there anything in the health committee meeting minutes discussing this? Also looking at those worker surveys, any guides, policies, procedures you have in place. All of this stuff is going to help paint a clearer picture of any violent incidents that have happened at your workplace and also what's already in place to deal with these situations. So a good rule of thumb is to review kind of that past year of documentation and see if there's anything that sticks out to you. And then conduct a risk assessment. This is another very important piece. Do a risk assessment to identify any positions, locations, and situations that pose the greatest risk. As we just discussed, right? Include the worksite areas and positions where violence has occurred already or has a high likelihood to occur. That should give you kind of a jumping point. And through that process of risk assessment, you're going to be able to identify additional positions or places that also might need attention. So that information is necessary to kind of decide what must be done in order to reduce those risks that are present. And, assess the level of risk for different types of violence, such as, again, like we said, customer aggression, right? Irate customers. That's probably going to be one that a lot of you are going to have, or if not all of you should have as part of your plan. Coworker disputes, right? That's probably pretty prevalent as well, I'd imagine. Also considering those external threats, like I said, robbery, right? Things like that. So it's going to involve you kind of categorizing those risks based on what you think the severity and likelihood might be of those situations. Yeah. And one thing I want to point out too, it's important for organizations with multiple sites operating that each site conducts a site-specific risk assessment. So there's going to be variation from one site to another, even if the layout of your facilities is similar. So it's up to each location to conduct a risk assessment. The organization may identify certain hazards and risks that everyone needs to consider, but there's also going to be those site-specific differences that we need to take into account. So this isn't one of those things where we're just kind of copying and pasting and we can roll it out to the entire organization. There's a piece here, especially in this risk assessment piece, that needs to be done at a site level to make sure that we're accurately identifying all the risks at our business. So just to kind of give you a little bit of ammo, some things that you can ask. And again, this will be provided in our resources as well in the risk assessment piece. So assess your workforce, right? So look at the training and experience of your work staff, their age and gender, their personalities and demeanors and attitudes. All these things play a factor when determining, obviously, if somebody's more at risk or possibly better able to handle certain risk factors. So ask questions like, are young workers on earlier or later shifts? Chances are you don't want somebody young and inexperienced working a later shift. You're going to want somebody with more experience working those shifts, somebody that's more familiar with executing the various different procedures and policies that we have in place. are experienced and fully trained workers on late night shifts and shifts that require them to work alone. Okay, so working alone is another thing that, again, we should wait till somebody's got a little bit more experience before we just kind of set them out on their own. People that are more experienced have likely dealt with more things, and also just have, again, that experience on their side where they've seen a lot of things, had to adjust a lot of things, possibly have had things happen to them in the past that they're going to be able to leverage that information and hopefully be able to act accordingly, or act, I guess, according to our procedures that are in place for that situation. So I just got a quick question that came through, and maybe somebody had the same question. It says, what was the date we must make these changes by? And it was actually May 17th, 2024 of this year. You were expected to have implemented these policy statements and your violence prevention plan. So some of you might feel like you're behind on it, but don't worry. That's what we're doing the webinar for, is to make you aware of it and hopefully give you the ammo you need moving forward. Coming back to the risk assessment, also ask questions like, is there an orientation and training program that we have in place to train existing and new workers, right? And that kind of segues nicely into the next slide, sorry. Does that training program help workers identify potential violent situations and use avoidance techniques? Does it help them with working with the police and knowing what to expect when they arrive? Does it cover off completing incident reports or forms? And we're going to talk about more what all needs to be included in the training as per the legislation. But these are some of the things that you should be thinking about when it comes to orientation and training your workers, ones that we're onboarding as well as existing employees. So assess your workplace environment as well, right? For each work site, you want to examine that physical layout of your space. And for each workplace where a violent incident or theft or something's occurred or is likely to occur, we want to note the impact of things like lighting, signage, security cameras, design, right? All these things should be considered. So questions you can ask, is there a door alarm? Does the door alert employees when someone enters the store or enters our building? Our garbage bins, like rooms and sheds, are they in well-lit areas? Sometimes when we do our facility inspections, and I've gone into areas where, they've got sea cans and different storage areas, and they're not very visible, and they're often in the back of the building. There's no lighting back there. So those things need to be taken into consideration as well. Is shelving low enough to maintain a line of sight from any point in the store to a customer? And I think that's a really good one as well. I don't know if anybody else does this. I know I do it personally, but when I sit in a restaurant or something with my wife, I like to make sure that I've got a vantage point or a viewpoint where I can see everything. And that's more just me being my family's defender, I guess you could say. But that's something that I do consistently when we go out. I want to be able to see everybody and be able to react accordingly if something happens, right? So something to consider. Another question, is the checkout counter located in a position with good visibility inside as well as outside the store? So all these things are considerations or questions you can ask to kind of help you develop or conduct that risk assessment. Assess administrative practices, and this is where you're probably going to get a lot of bang for your buck as well. Because when we talk about using controls to mitigate risk, oftentimes we'll see a combination of things, and we're almost always going to see some form of an administrative practice or procedure that employees can leverage in different situations. So it says what questions you can ask, or I should say, before we go into this, when we're looking at this, I always think like high risk activities like working alone, working late at night, working with people who are maybe known to be violent or kind of exhibit unpredictable or agitated behaviors that could result in violence, completing cash deposits, right? Opening or closing a premise or other activities. All these things could ultimately or have a high risk of violence associated with them. And we need to have, again, appropriate practices and procedures and administrative processes in place to do these things. I know one thing that I used to do in my former job as loss prevention manager is closing down the building. Oftentimes it would be late at night, especially when we get into winter and we lose our light so quick. I mean, it goes from, having light at 9 as late as maybe even 10 o'clock at night to all of a sudden, I go to work and it's dark out, and I come out of work and it's dark out at, 4:30, 5 o'clock. So obviously as the winter season changes, we're going to have less lighting. And again, another factor to consider. So like I said, when we would close down our building, we had a process for walking workers, certain workers who would request it out to their vehicles at night. Obviously, certain lockup procedures. I know personally for me, because of the type of work we're involved in, always parked my car where it was very well lit, because I had been threatened in the past by somebody. And so you're just trying to do things and like I said, participate in certain practices and procedures that are going to mitigate these risks to people. So ask questions like what kind of practices, procedures, or precautions are currently in place, because they might cover your business kind of for things that are present now, but maybe things that you haven't also considered as we go through the risk assessment process. Are those practices and procedures in use, or are they used properly? I always think, when we do audits, we always ask people, are you prepared for the following emergencies? And, they say yes or no. And I always get a kick out of one when I ask people if they're prepared for power outages. And they say, well, if the power's out, not much I can do. I guess I just go and grab a coffee. And I said, okay, well, but what would you do if there was a power outage? Like, what would your response be? And they say, I don't know, just walk to the lunchroom, I guess. And I'm like, well, yeah, but would you power down any equipment? There's got to be a process in place. The reason why we ask these questions is because if you actually have a power outage policy in place, chances are, a procedure in place, I should say, you're going to know that, oh yeah, I've got to power down all of my equipment before I, just go to the lunchroom. Because if I'm not around and that equipment is energized, obviously we might have a problem there, right? So making sure that any practices and procedures that you have, that they're actually being utilized by your workforce, and that they understand that they're there, and that they're trained to them. If there are none in place, what procedures and preventative measures are going to help reduce and eliminate risk, right? So these are some of the different questions that you might ask as you're doing your risk assessment. Consultation and development, like I said, this is an important one. And you'll see right at the top, we have surveys again. Like I said, these ones kind of mesh together a little bit, because in terms to identifying and assessing our workplace, we're going to want that consultation piece a little bit as a part of that. And that's why I say, when you administer the surveys, that's a form of consultation with your workforce, right? So again, looking at surveys, soliciting feedback from other people within the workforce and key stakeholders at your business, right? Have focus groups. Maybe that's amongst your management and supervisory team. And again, get their input on perceived risks and suggestions for improvements in their areas. It's just going to help you kind of better understand those day-to-day realities that your staff or your workforce is facing. So like I said, whether you want to do those focus groups or breakout groups with supervisors and managers and include workers in there, all that stuff obviously is relevant. So your health committees and your safety representatives and workers, right? Collaborating with them. They have valuable insight. And I always say that, the people that are doing the activities on a day-to-day basis and that are front customer facing positions, you're going to want the input from those people, right? So make sure that you consult with them, your committees, everybody in your workforce, essentially, to get a better, well-rounded idea of where your risks are. And obviously consult with us as well. If you have any questions, I think I've had probably at least half a dozen violence policies sent to me for review. Again, if you need some help in developing these, or you just need some feedback, how does this look? Am I covered? Send it to us, get a hold of us, and we'd be more than happy to help you along with those. So drafting the policy and plan. So make sure that you incorporate any feedback from your workforce and key stakeholders as you were doing that consultation and identifying and assessing, right? And review or revise your policy based on that information. Ensure that you have, as you draft your policy, you have clear definitions and roles and responsibilities for everybody. And that includes, procedures for reporting and responding to incidents, and also the consequences of violating the policy as well. Make sure that you have procedures for informing your workers, right, of the nature and extent of the risk of violence at the workplace. So there needs to be the employer, I should say, is required to describe the procedure that they're going to use to inform workers about the nature and extent of violent incidents at the workplace that could occur, and also about persons who are known or have been violent at the workplace before. So we actually, like I said, I always kind of defer back to my experience in loss prevention. We actually had a couple of people that were known as violent offenders, and we had pictures given out to staff. We never ever put those pictures out in their kiosks, but we'd actually have them in their areas when they would go into the security or through doors that were, I guess, secure and had employee access only. There would be pictures on the wall of those people so that they could be on the lookout for them. And we had specific procedures for exactly what to do if that person, you see that person in our retail premises, or they approach you, or what have you. We had different procedures in place. So again, that's something that you're going to have in place as well, for situations that you know to be violent, or people that you know to be violent and have shown those behaviors before. So looking at more procedures, it must be in place for managing these violent incidents. And we want to make sure these procedures cover off the following items. They should enable your workers to report any instance of violence to management or supervisory staff, including threats and physical acts of violence. The employer should be stating how they're going to document and investigate these incidents as well. So again, having incident report forms and having a process that your employees can use to fill out that documentation. And then again, how are you going to go about handling those results in the investigation side of things? Stating obligations of workers to report violent incidents and to complete those forms, right? Making sure that if something does happen, that people are reporting it, not just brushing it under the rug, and providing sufficient information and explanation to workers on how to complete these incident forms as well. So this piece continued. These procedures should contain measures to help workers also cope with injuries and post-traumatic stress. This might be through employee assistance programs. You may give your worker paid time off to recover, ensuring that if they've been injured possibly or traumatized by a violent incident, that they're given sufficient time to recover. And that includes, again, both physical as well as mental health recovery time. Offering peer support groups maybe at your business for people who've experienced something similar, things like that. So again, making sure that we've got those things in place for our workforce. It also your procedures need to contain a recommendation that any worker exposed to a violent incident consult their physician for treatment or referral for post-incident counseling. Again, some people are this might just be, they might just brush it off their shoulders, so to speak. Other people, it might kind of, bother them more, depending on the person. So make sure that, again, that we're recommending that they go and seek some treatment to deal with those things if they need to. Make sure you include your health committee or your representative, or if you don't have a committee or representative, your workers in investigating and reviewing incidents of violence. And providing procedures to recommend the corrective action needed to prevent a reoccurrence. And obviously our health committees oftentimes will see investigations and incidents like this taken up at their committee meetings, and they provide recommendations based on that information. They might even want to go and conduct an inspection of the area where the violent incident happened, to get a better lay of the land, so to speak, and again, help in providing corrective action or recommendations for corrective action to the employer. So always look when you're kind of developing controls, because ultimately, when we're going about developing our policy and our plan, one thing that is going to be essential to this plan is putting the appropriate controls in place to eliminate or minimize the risks of violence at your business. And we often look at, and you've probably seen this before, the hierarchy of controls. So you can see from top to bottom, we have most effective to least effective. So elimination, physically remove the hazard, right? So let's have a quick look at an example. So you might use physical security, and I actually just dealt with this the other day. So you might remove the potential for violence by limiting public access, say, to certain areas, or by redesigning your workforce or your workplace, I should say, to enhance safety. So a perfect example of this was I actually tried to go and visit one of our newer members recently, and I couldn't get in without a key code. They had you had to have one of those little fobs on you, and obviously I didn't have one. And then on the door it said by appointment only. So this allows them to essentially screen persons who want access to their facility, and it's going to have a much higher desire, I guess, or there's going to be a much higher probability of them being able to eliminate the risk of violence as a result of having that in place. So that might be a good example of elimination. How about substitution, replacing the hazard? So this might look like customer interaction modification. So maybe rather than doing a face-to-face interaction with somebody, possibly is it possible that we can do this meeting virtually? We have access to that type of technology now. So is there other non-direct methods of interacting with the customer? And obviously, I don't want to say that we shouldn't be doing relationship building and meeting people in person. But like I said, in situations where somebody's maybe a little bit more irritable, or they're kind of one of those types of customers, is there an opportunity for us to change how we interact with them? And maybe that is doing a virtual meeting rather than in person. So that might be a form of substitution if you're using control measures. Looking at engineering controls, so isolate people from the hazard. So sometimes we can do things like installing physical barriers such as plexiglass windows or security doors in high-risk areas. And obviously, when we saw COVID, we saw some of those types of physical barriers put up for other reasons. But I think a perfect example of this would be, again, our service stations. Oftentimes, we'll see them now because of the high risk of being robbed at night. Oftentimes now they don't let people into the store. They lock up shop, and there's a little window there where they can order things from the outside of the store, and it better protects the worker who's working that night shift. So that's a perfect example of an engineering control that could be put in place. How about administrative controls? So this comes down to our procedures, and again, how to deal with things like irate customers, right? How about shoplifters and cash handling procedures, closing and opening the building procedures. So ensuring your workers are trained in those procedures is going to be very important, and also training them on how to recognize threats and how to respond to those threats. All of these things are considered administrative controls. Also considering, again, how you schedule people, right? Do we have younger people working at night, or should we put maybe somebody with a little bit more experience there? Maybe rather than having a newer worker work alone, maybe we could pair them with somebody. So all these things should be taken into consideration from the administrative controls. And this is probably where we're going to use the most controls, is out of this section. Between that and engineering controls is probably where you're going to see a lot of controls for mitigating risk at your business as it pertains to violence. PPE, I mean, this one's somewhat limited, but there's things like we consider radios or mobile communication devices could be considered a form of PPE, and they may be used by employees in high-risk situations. Oftentimes, actually, you'll even see service attendants at a gas station. They might have an alarm button underneath, a silent alarm, which alerts the police to what's going on. So there's situations like that, or like I said, maybe two-way radio where you can kind of keep in constant contact with your team or emergency services, whatever the case is. Again, that's an option for you. There's also personal alarm devices out there that might discreetly alert security. Like I said, not just underneath a service station, but also maybe on the person. So there's little things that you can use from a PPE standpoint, but I think like I said, for the most part, what we're going to see from a controls standpoint is going to probably be within those administrative and engineering controls. But always work your way from top to bottom through this process. That's going to allow you to ensure that we're not missing any controls that might be more effective. So in drafting your policy and plan, it must be in writing, and it needs to include a statement of your employer's commitment to minimize or eliminate the risk of violence. It needs to include workers in developing, maintaining, or updating that policy statement and prevention plan. Like I said, consultation, very important, and provide that training program that I had mentioned for workers. And that training program needs to include certain things. Okay. So under the regulations, the employer is obligated to provide training to people that may be at risk of violence in the workplace. And that program should consider things like the means to recognize potentially violent situations. It should also be in depth about including the various procedures and work practices that are in place and administrative arrangements and any engineering controls that they're going to develop or utilize to minimize that risk to their workforce. There should be proper responses of workers to incidents of violence, including how to obtain assistance, procedures for reporting those incidents, and the means to understand their obligation to also refrain from participating in or carrying out acts of violence. And keep in mind, we had went through a pretty extensive list of things. And like I said, whether it's implied, kind of acting like you're going to smack someone or punch them sort of thing, like all of those things are considered. So ensure that you're refraining from those types of activities. And like I said, all of these things need to be covered as part of a training program by your employer. When we look at kind of the difference in training, I guess the final step of effectively implementing these is also ensuring that it's understood and accepted and followed by everyone, but also understanding that there's different responsibilities underneath the training and education for these programs. So your employees, for example, they're going to have those mandatory training sessions that they have to be a part of, and it should be kind of focusing on the policies and procedures in place and how to recognize, report, and respond to workplace violence. Right? That training should be practical and scenario based and accessible to all employees. And then there's the training that you would administer to your supervisor and management team. So they're going to have additional training because they're going to have specific responsibilities under your policy, including how to handle those reports of violence and also to support employees that have been affected by those situations. Incident reporting and response. So ensure that you set up a reliable, confidential system for reporting incidents of violence. Ensure that everybody knows how to use that system and understand that they are protected from any retaliation for reporting acts of violence. Make sure that we implement clear protocols for responding to violent incidents, including immediate actions, any investigation procedures, as well as post-incident support. Where workers actually receive medical treatment or counseling after a violent incident, the employer is required by law to credit a worker's attendance for treatment or counseling as time worked. Okay, so employers must ensure that workers do not lose pay or other benefits to attend appointments related to violent incidents at the workplace. And the policy statement and prevention plan must inform workers of this entitlement and the employer's obligation as well. When it comes to WCB claims, so in Saskatchewan, the Workers' Compensation Act recognizes all forms of psychological injury incurred by a worker, and that's including but not limited to post-traumatic stress disorder, arising from their work unless there's evidence to the contrary. But if a worker sustains an injury, consults a physician or attends counseling after a violent incident, a report of injury needs to be submitted by the employer and by the worker to the WCB. And at that point, the WCB will open a file, collect reports, and make claim benefit decisions based on that information. Communication. So, when we're disseminating our policy, ensuring that your policy is widely distributed and accessible to all of your employees. And again, this can be done through posting it on your safety bulletin board, making sure that this information is available in handbooks, toolbox talks, right? Make sure you discuss your policy and plan throughout the year. Physically posting it in common areas, your lunchrooms, things like that, and obviously ensuring that our workers have training, but more than anything, ensuring that this information is visible throughout your workplace. You should also establish a schedule for regularly communicating about the policy. And like I said, I had mentioned kind of safety meetings, toolbox talks, good opportunity to do that, and include reminders of key points and updates on any changes to your policies. So the policy statement and prevention plan, it must be reviewed every 3 years. And whenever there is a change of circumstances that may affect the health or safety of workers, workers must be consulted when the policy is being reviewed, and they must be informed when changes are planned or have been made. So retraining may also be required in these situations. So again, schedule regular review of the policy. Make sure that you incorporate any changes that have been made to legislation, workplace conditions, or other things like that. Review should also consider things like lessons learned from prior incidents and also feedback from employees, right? You should always be kind of fostering that culture of continuous improvement and evolving your policy as needed, because you're going to face possibly new challenges and maybe get different insights from your workforce as you go. Excuse me. So make sure that we're considering these things and that we're continuously trying to improve and monitor our policies and seeking that feedback and consultation from our workforce. So late night retail premises. So this the definition of this in the legislation means a place of employment that is open to the public between the hours of 11 and 6. So, I should specify 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. in the morning. So for the purposes of making retail sales to consumers, that is what would be the definition of a late night retail premises. Now, they're actually required to take additional precautions to protect employees working late night hours. So, for example, some precautions we're going to talk about here just momentarily. Just give me 1 second here. My froze up. There we go. Sorry, there we go. So some of these additional requirements are going to be considering these various different controls and procedures when implementing your policy if you happen to work at a service station within our rate code. So definitely consider these things. Again, employers must, and I should say this actually, so like I had said, you're required to do that risk assessment, but late night retail premises, they don't have an option. They must ensure that they've done a hazard assessment and that it's been reviewed and updated at a minimum of every 3 years or sooner. Or again, whenever there's a change to circumstances or the health and safety of workers, they must do those risk evaluations and hazard assessments. Things they need to consider, additional things they need to consider in their operations is things like working alone. We had kind of discussed that a little bit, but there needs to be a check-in system and a written check-in procedure in place for these businesses. Again, a personal emergency transmitter that signals or calls for emergency response personnel that must actually be available and worn by the workers at all times. They need to have certain cash handling procedures in place. So opening and closing a premises and cashing in and out, those are all well-known high risk activities. And employers need to have procedures to minimize or eliminate the risks associated with those activities. So two requirements are safe cash handling procedures. Those are required to minimize the amount of money that's available to the workers, or I guess you could say the public, if they're going to rob you at any given point of the night, and ensure procedures are written and readily available to workers. Sometimes you will see even gas stations not accept certain forms of currency, or I should say, $100 bills or more, anything over $50 sort of thing, right? So again, these are all little practices and procedures to prevent, violent incidents from occurring. And also engineering controls. They are required to have video cameras, and they must capture key areas in a workplace, including the cash desk, and if applicable, also outdoor gas pumps. So measures must be taken to ensure good visibility into and out of the premises, such as not blocking windows with signs or posters, and signs indicating the worker has limited access to cash and that video surveillance is in use must also be posted. So those are some additional requirements for people operating late night retail premises. And I've heard companies that's within our rate code saying that they're considering being open 24/7 or working those late night shifts. So make sure that you take those into consideration. So just a couple things before we leave, some best practices. So make sure that you date your original policy statement and prevention plan and each revised version. It's just a good practice to help you maintain your document. Document when policies and procedures or other practices come into use or revised. Again, just upkeep with your documentation. Provide periodic refresher training to keep worker knowledge and skills up to date, and not just refresher training, but again, talking about these things in toolbox talks and safety meetings and bringing up our policies and procedures, and ensuring someone on staff is knowledgeable and experienced and well trained in all aspects of this plan and statement. And that's probably going to be the person who's developing it that's going to have the most intimate knowledge of this plan, as well as your management and supervisory staff should as well. So in developing an effective workplace violence policy and prevention plan, it requires a structured approach. And like I said, that begins with a thorough assessment and involves broad consultation with your workforce, and should be followed by careful implementation. So by following these steps, hopefully this is going to create a robust policy that not only complies with our legal requirements and framework, but also effectively protects your workforce from violence in the workplace. And some key messages I just want to highlight is violence prevention is now mandatory for all businesses in our province. Okay. This was meant to have a well-rounded, comprehensive approach, not only in who it covers, but also in the policy development and the risk assessment portion, as well as introducing preventative measures and offering training. So, and engagement and collaboration. Again, engage with your workforce, right? They're the ones who are often most exposed to these types of hazards. So collaborating with them, getting their input, right? Doing the worker surveys, discussing it with your health committees. All of these things are going to give you the best opportunity to put in place and develop the best plan possible. So that is all I've got for you today on violence in the workplace. I was asked here in the comment section, is this going to be made available? Yes, all these webinars are recorded and made available on our website at www.motorsafety.ca. So go check it out. I should have it uploaded onto the website by this afternoon. So, or I should say our admin staff should. So definitely go and check it out and rewatch it if you'd like. And also be aware that when you go and register for the webinar, if you go to access the webinar, there's also going to be within that webinar some resources that are available to you as well. So be on the lookout for those, as they're going to help you develop your policy statement and plans. So I just want to thank everybody for your attendance today, and hope you enjoyed the webinar and took some learning points from it. If you have any questions, again, feel free to give us a shout at 306-721-0688, or email info@motorsafety.ca, and we'd be happy to help you out, whether that's reviewing your policy, developing your policy, or any other safety activities or services that you require. So once again, thank you so much for your participation and being here today. Hope you have a safe rest of your day, and we'll be seeing you on the next webinar. Take care for now.